Svelte versus React Native. Which should you use to build apps with JavaScript in 2020? Hey all, Steve Kolock here. I'm a senior front-end engineer with most of my experience in e-commerce, accessibility, and search engine optimization, focused even more so around user dashboards and user interaction. I work a 9 to 5 and I'm on the journey to build a side project into a side business. I'm talking about programming, making product decisions, and more. Like and subscribe to get updates and learn how I'm making tech, marketing, and product decisions for my side projects. Today I'm going to share my considerations in choosing between Svelte, React, and React Native for my main project, ZoomGames.app. To give you a little background and context around this, when I decided to build ZoomGames.app to get it up, running, and profitable in 2020, I looked at the different tech stacks out there and tried to figure out what was best to quickly build fast, robust, device agnostic, and SEO friendly apps. So I have a few years working in React for both side projects and enterprise level apps. So naturally I consider both React and then also React Native, which I don't know, or I hadn't known when I initially started this. I actually built 2 games in React Native using Expo before hitting an SEO wall and then deciding to learn and move to Svelte instead. In this video, I'm just going to explain how I made my decision to choose React Native over React and then Svelte over both. As always, take my thoughts with a bucket of salt, as you may have considerations that I don't have to worry about or vice versa. I wanted to ensure that the library that I used gave me the tools to fit the following criteria. Number 1, fast on desktop and different devices. Number 2, good SEO capabilities. Because SEO is part of my background, I didn't want to have to spend a lot of time doing marketing, and just having the advantage of SEO seemed to make more sense than putting something out there that I'd have to spend a lot of time trying to just like push out and be salesy about. And then 3, I wanted something that integrated well with external tools such as Firebase for Auth, Cloud Functions, and more, and Hasura, which I had decided I wanted to use for speedy implementation of GraphQL with subscriptions for real time. So let's go ahead and dive right into the comparisons. React describes itself as a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It's declarative, which means that it abstracts away the implementation details of rendering, responding to events, etc. from your code. It's excellent for optimizing renders, giving you a clear paradigm for thinking about UIs and responding to events, and then writing reusable, componentized code. I highly recommend it for anyone working in dynamic dashboards or interactive experiences who wants something that's tried and true and got a robust tool set out there supporting it. And regarding my project criteria, it actually fits all 3. So because my day-to-day work is writing React that works across mobile devices and of course desktop, and optimizing to reduce the data/performance strain on mobile devices, we're good there. It won't give me something that I can deploy into the App Store, but that's debatable at this point if that's necessary. So likewise, I know I can use semantic HTML and a framework like Next.js or Gatsby if I were working on something more static, to have an isomorphic app that would render pages server-side for better bot crawlability and performance. And number 3, I've seen dozens of tutorials, GitHub repos, and example apps, along with documentation to integrate with Firebase, Hasura, pretty much anything out there to deploy on Next, to deploy on Firebase, to deploy, or not Next, to deploy on Vercel, and of course to deploy with NetMoPy. There's no shortage of information about React and how to do any number of things with a React app. You can probably find tutorials on cloning everything under the sun on YouTube right now with React. Now on top of that, there's some other huge pros to using React. And like I just kind of hinted at, it has a massive footprint in the JavaScript community, and you can find docs, packages, example repos, and integrations for React very, very easily. And a lot of those are high quality and tried and true. So this means that 99.9% of the things you want to be able to do, someone has laid out a way to do it or built a package that can help you do it in React. This allows you to focus on the unique value propositions of what you're building instead of the boilerplate. So that saves you time that can be crucial, especially with a side project, and really what you want to do is focus on your idea. Number 2, as far as pros for React, it transforms how you think about state management and has tried and true patterns for state management that are now native to React itself. So I won't go into exactly how state is managed in React because that's not really the purpose of this video, but thinking in React makes developing and testing complex apps much easier, and it's definitely a viable solution for this kind of problem. It'll still work on mobile devices. It won't out of the box give you an installable app, but that might not be something you need to worry about. And then number 3, and to me this is probably the biggest pro of working in React or learning React and therefore developing a side project in it, is jobs. Depending upon your current situation, this could be the most or least important factor in deciding which front-end library to use. But if you're looking to develop a skill for the current job market, then learning React is an excellent investment of your time and energy. On a quick search on Glassdoor.com, there are over 32,500 job listings that mention React, and there are about 2,500 React Native jobs. For comparison, there are exactly 27 Svelte jobs. So if job search is your main criteria here, then that alone should answer the debate for which technology you definitely need to spend some time on. If you want to land a full-time job working in technology that you haven't worked in yet, then the best way I know is to use that tech in side projects or a side business to go ahead and get you some of the experience that a lot of companies like to see on your resume and give you some points to talk to, make those interviews a little bit easier for you as well. Now, I know that job numbers alone may make React sound like a slam dunk, but I did initially pick React Native for my project and then switch to Svelte. So stick around and don't forget to like and subscribe so you can learn about the pros of Svelte in comparison to React and why I eventually made the journey through to Svelte. Now talking about React Native. So first, before we get to talking about Svelte and how my decision came about, let's talk about React Native because it's basically an implementation of React that works across devices and compiles down to native Android and iOS code, so you can create apps for the App Store, for the various app stores, as well as run your code on the web. There are important differences between React and React Native, such as different elements that you'll need to use and different packages you need to use to achieve the same things in one versus the other. So there definitely is a learning curve, even if you know React, or vice versa if you're coming from React Native to React. However, if you do know React already, then the learning curve to React Native is not too steep, and you have a pretty good idea of a lot of the different components that you want to swap in, such as for navigation. Even though they're not the exact same component, it's almost a one-to-one in terms of using like React navigation versus like React router or something like that. What I found too is if you use Expo especially, which is an awesome SDK for developing in React Native, and that speeds up setup and helps you get coding a lot quicker too. So now regarding the criteria for my app, because we end up with native code and installable apps for iOS and Android, we focus on device-first development in many ways with React Native, and that helps a lot with speed. In addition, you're able to take advantage of native APIs, which means you can even have platform-specific code that lets you tweak your app as needed. While React Native implies you can write the same code and it'll work everywhere, there may be cases where you do need to tweak your code for a specific device, and React Native allows you to do that by providing builds for web, iOS, and Android. For simpler apps, you might not need to do this at all, so it definitely checks the box for having device-ready code that'll work as well as in the browser. So on the second point, this is where I messed up. I thought because React Native is compiled down for web, I'd be able to take advantage of the semantic HTML like I'm used to and build my app with this in mind. It turns out that I end up with divs all over the place unless I actively state that on the web I want a component to be an H1 or something like that. Now I did find a package that abstracted that logic away, so essentially I was able to use this package and write components where it knew it would optimize it for semantic HTML if I put like an H1 within the component, and then just otherwise compile down to all those divs, etc. But that started to get me down the rabbit hole of, okay, well, how many different packages am I going to need to import to do the things that I take for granted on the web and that I was going to rely on to get an audience for my app? It seemed like there was already a lot of extra weight in adding all these different React Native packages. I also started looking at how exactly I was going to work through rendering my different site structure in a crawlable manner. And this became a large problem that I would have to tackle before continuing on. So basically, because I made some assumptions about React Native and didn't do enough research there, I made a bad decision when it came to web SEO, and it bit me. Now, I'm happy that I got to learn some React Native, play around with it, and experience that for myself, but obviously because this was such a big deal for what I wanted out of my app and out of the tool set that I'm building the app from, I had to just cut and run. Let me see if there's something else out there, either just do Next.js and then figure out how I was going to optimize for devices, or find something else. Now, to point number 3 though, in terms of my criteria, there are many packages and integrations for React Native, especially if you're using Expo. So despite this fact that there is so much support out there and there's a large community out there, what I found as I was developing more and more using Expo was that some of the packages I needed were old, outdated, or in beta. Now, those 3 things should not alone tell you you shouldn't use a technology, but all of those are cases where you might end up having breaking changes if you're going to make an upgrade. So it's definitely maybe not a red flag, but a yellow flag. If you want to be on the cutting edge, then you're going to find everything's in beta. So that's, for some people that's comfortable. For me, I wasn't comfortable with accumulating tech debt. So while the React Native community is very strong, it's still not as large as the React one, and many of the packages are sorts of wrappers around React packages. This mostly suited my needs, but there's risk for any project that you'll end up needing something that isn't readily available and that you take for granted, much like I did, especially if you're coming from a web background. I would imagine if you're coming from like an Android-specific development background or an iOS-specific development background, you might also see some of that. But the pros of React Native are pretty similar to React. There's still over 2,500 job listings on Glassdoor currently, so the market is still there. It's definitely large, even if not as large as React. For your own apps, React Native is definitely a viable way to build the skills and build using one code base for all devices. Number 2, the ecosystem is definitely large and robust, but if you're coming from React, then you might find it deficient when expecting to find similar packages or React Native versions of packages that you know and love. That said, this is a pro if you're also interested in contributing to open source and want to take the opportunity to do that, or if your app is pretty simple from a development standpoint. Number 3, I love the effects and a lot of the boilerplate that I was able to get with Expo and React navigation packages together. Being used to web navigation, it was really cool to see how quickly I could put together a genuine app-like experience for the web and for devices. That boilerplate and setup did take a little bit of time, but there are so many great courses out there. There's such great information. It wasn't too drastic. Now, number 4, in terms of the pros for React Native, Expo itself made dev on mobile really easy. They've got a great emulator, so you can actually look at your local build on your phone and see what it looks like there, as well as you can use the emulators for iOS or Android and check things out too. So I'm highly appreciative of that. That was one of the biggest pluses of Expo. Beyond the quick setup was just the setup for actually running your local code on your phone. So I did really enjoy working in React Native, but because of the SEO issue, and also hearing about the controversy with the App Store and Hey, luckily around this time I started looking back at Svelte and did a course on frontendmasters.com on it. Highly recommend that course. Rich Harris, the person who developed Svelte, actually gives the course, so as you might imagine, it's pretty comprehensive, and he has a very clear way of explaining things, so I highly recommend that. I wish I were affiliated with Frontend Masters because I tell everyone that they are one of the best resources, if not the best resource, for learning modern development on the front end. All right, so let's talk about Svelte because that is by far my favorite of the 3. Svelte's tagline is that it enables you to create cybernetically enhanced web apps. That sounds awesome and terrifying at the same time, so we'll get into what that means shortly. Svelte is the newish kid on the block for most of us. You may have experience in React or React Native, but it's pretty unlikely you have much experience, at least professionally, with Svelte. One of its main value propositions is that it's all written in valid JavaScript, even though it uses some esoteric syntax. That means that there's potentially a much lower barrier to entry, and in addition, you're writing JavaScript code that compiles down to optimized JavaScript and works natively in the browser, as opposed to creating a virtual DOM on top of it, which is what React does. It comes with built-in scoped CSS that can also be made global, and you use single-file components with CSS, JavaScript, and HTML all together, much like Vue. It's fast, lightweight, and doesn't require complex state management libraries, and is created for the needs of the modern web. You can also use a lot of the tooling that's out there because you still have your ability to config with Webpack, or rollup, which is what it defaults to. So you can use TypeScript, you can use Sass or less, or whatever else you want, and you can still compile your CSS that way. How does Svelte fit into the criteria for my app? Well, it's fast on desktop and devices. This is the foremost value that I see for a lot of people in using Svelte in general, but using Svelte with Sapper in particular. Now, Sapper is a framework built for Svelte, analogous to Next.js and React. It has built-in PWA support, SSR, and service worker functionality, so out of the box, just by using Sapper, you get an installable web app. Further, you don't need to import nearly as many libraries for building Svelte apps as you do with React, since, again, you're using vanilla.js, so ultimately you're delivering less code to do the same things, and you don't need all these wrappers around that code. This is particularly good for mobile devices where data and bandwidth are always concerns. Because PWAs are installable, we check that box for Android and iOS, but actually putting the app in the App Store looks like it could be daunting for iOS, far less so for Android. That said, around the time when I was comparing all of these things, the more I thought about the cost and restrictions of adding an app to the App Store, including adding any Cordova wrappers that might be necessary for iOS, I realized I was okay not tackling that right away, and as long as my app works well on devices. Also, due in part to the controversy that's going on with the Hey Email app in Apple, I devalued getting the app into the App Store immediately, and I kind of realized I can cross that bridge at a later date, but simply having a PWA checks off a lot of the boxes that I really wanted in terms of experience and use on a device. So number 2, good SEO capabilities and performance. When you go to the svelte.dev site, in the top right menu you'll see a link for Sapper. Sapper, as I mentioned in the Svelte intro, takes inspiration from Next.js, which is a framework for React that sets up a lot of best practices focused around isomorphic rendering, allowing for great SEO and for easy SEO enhancements such as adding page titles, meta descriptions, schema.org, open graph, and Twitter card tags to dynamically generated pages. All this is stuff that can be used and picked up by web crawlers, and in the case of OG and Twitter card tags, can be used for better shareability. Now, most important, if you're using Sapper for an app and run Chrome's Lighthouse to test performance, you get impressive numbers right out of the box across the board for things like best practices, SEO, accessibility, of course the PWA installable numbers, and performance overall. And because that's without any effort, to me that's already a huge win. Having that PWA where someone can be prompted to install the app and install it on their phone, install it on, and it'll show up on their home screen, install it on their desktop device. Those are huge wins again. Now once you start building your app, you likely won't even lose much in terms of performance as you add complexity because, again, Svelte and Sapper do such outstanding work optimizing your setup and code, and you're not forced to carry around a ton of extra NPM packages compared to React or React Native. Additionally, Sapper lets you parameterize folder names so that you can have a very dynamic site structure with pages that have common layouts rendered server-side without having to do any real configuration yourself. Site structure is a huge part of good SEO, so this is, again, a huge win in my book. Because you're writing regular old HTML in Svelte, you get to use all the proper semantic HTML to give your pages a good, crawlable, accessible structure. Arguably, you have all the above with Next.js, but you might have to do more configuration, especially when it comes to PWA. But remember, you're importing fewer packages and sending less code, and again, compiled and optimized code, to the browser when you use Svelte. So page speed and time to first byte should improve as well when compared with Next even. So those are the things that make a crawler happy. The speed of your pages is also going to be very important, not only to your SEO and your performance, but also to your users. And now number 3, that it integrates well with external tools. So this was at the same time easier and harder. Because Svelte is just JavaScript, many of the SDKs will apply if you're looking at them for any number of things like Firebase or Hasura or Heroku, Netlify, like any kind of deployments, any setup like that will be pretty straightforward with Svelte. But I'm also used to looking at SDKs that are in React, and sometimes there are differences there. And when it comes to telling you how to integrate, there are some things that you would think could be confusing. Luckily, with Svelte, there's actually the same kind of lifecycle hooks that you have in React. So for many of the instances where you might wait until use effect, or if you're doing a component did mount, you'll have Svelte's on mount that you have access to. So it's actually pretty similar in setup using Svelte compared with React in a lot of ways. So you can use the SDKs as a good guide. So this came in handy with setting up some of the Firebase functionality. None of this was really a complex idea to get around, but something as simple as having lifecycle methods available can seem difficult when you're still learning a new library. So the fact that Svelte puts them out there up front, you have access to them, it takes care of a lot of that concern that you might otherwise have, and you don't really have to think about it in a new way if you're familiar with React. They're fairly straightforward, so the documentation is pretty good there too if you're not familiar with any library or framework. In addition, even though there's almost no documentation around setting up integrations specifically in Svelte, when using normal SDKs, you can pretty much always reference a Next.js implementation if you have questions, if there is one, or like some Next.js example, and figure out the differences if there are many. Connecting to Hasura and Firebase is probably only slightly harder for me with Svelte and Sapper than with React, which is to say not too hard at all. And that's only because of these tiny little learning curves that I needed to overcome. I have yet to come across anything that I wanted to integrate with Svelte that I've been unable to do so. And so as far as this goes, I'd say Svelte passes that test. So there are additional pros in my eyes. I know this is a long video, but please like and subscribe and let me know if you want me to do more of them where I go in depth about these decisions or if there's something else that you'd like to see. So my favorite thing about creating games or any interactive UI in Svelte specifically is the way it allows you to create transitions and animations so easily out of the box. Previously, I've had to bring in either GSAP or write my own functions for creating staggered and dynamic animations, which takes a lot of time and a lot of tiny tweaking. With Svelte, you get access to tweens, motions, transitions, and animations with different easing styles you can apply. There's also an excellent demo, so you can play with the demo before you even pull it into your code and see what things might look like. You can still write your own custom CSS or JS transitions, but I'm not sure whether 99.9% of people using Svelte will ever need to. With creating a game, since part of the allure is the UX on interaction, I'm really happy to take advantage of quick, out-of-the-box and optimized transitions that I know I can always make more complex or more interesting later if it doesn't quite suit me further down the road. Beyond that, Svelte's quick, clear ability to hook into the HTML canvas element is also smooth and intuitive, whereas I'm not sure I'd say the same thing for React for most newcomers, mostly because of having to create and think about refs and context. Svelte also has a handy demo of different easings and motion functions, so taking advantage of these transitions and animations has a very low barrier of entry. All of these add up to a robust, out-of-the-box UI capabilities without the weight of additional packages, libraries, and time. And now number 3 in terms of pros here, this isn't really a pro, but I'll go ahead and say it because I think it's an important point to bring up. It simply doesn't have the traction that React does. And when I last looked for Svelte jobs, I found only 27 on Glassdoor. That means that React has 1,000 times more opportunities for work out there than Svelte. So if you're developing a side project with the idea of enhancing your skill set in order to get a job or switch jobs, then I can't recommend Svelte in good faith. Maybe down the road, but right now you'd be on the bleeding edge of that curve, and there's just not a lot of jobs out there. However, if you're trying to get something performant built quickly and deployed, I highly recommend swallowing the month-ish learning curve it'll take to get the fundamentals down of Svelte, because with even the basics, you can do some really cool stuff out of the box as a PWA, especially if you're using Sapper as your springboard. Those are my thoughts, and that's why I chose Svelte for developing ZoomGames.app, where I'm going to keep working in it. I'll be happy to give more insight as I continue developing, but like, subscribe, and let me know your thoughts on whether I gave these 3 a fair evaluation, or if you think I missed some good points, and whether you consider using Svelte, React, or React Native for your next projects in 2020 and 2021. That's all for now.